Thank you all so much for coming and for participating in this dialogue. I'm got from Ben some questions that some of the students in this course had sort of jotted down along the way, and they were great questions. It makes me very eager to have a discussion, and I'll try to keep my opening comments reasonably short and basically directed to giving some framework and background that will allow those kinds of questions to have a context for being asked. So I'm looking forward to that very much. The reason that I'm here to speak to you, and the reason that I wrote this book, and they always tell you to hold it up, Common Preservation in a Time of Mutual Destruction, is basically because of problems we share in common. And you know, when I came into concern about politics and political activism, really as a kid, was at the time of the Cold War, where we were dealing with fear and potential reality of nuclear holocaust all the time. And I was one of those people who had to duck and cover under their desk as preparation for a nuclear attack. And some of the first protests I was involved with were against nuclear testing and against the civil defense program. And it's quite disturbing to me, as you could imagine, that we are now again facing threats of nuclear holocaust growing out of the Ukraine war, the threats that are being made of the use of nuclear weapons, and the opportunities both for deliberate and also for accidental nuclear weapons use that seems to be growing there. And then to come up to the subject that I've been working on mostly for the last at least dozen years, climate change. Again, this is something, a threat that we share, that we're facing, and that, as with nuclear warfare, it's very hard to figure out what can people do about it. Everyone's potentially threatened by these phenomena, and yet it's very hard to figure out what it would mean to make some kind of effective response to them, and basically to get them under some kind of human control. So Common Preservation, the book, grows out of my thinking about and participating in movements around issues of this kind, writing about them, studying them over the last half century. And essentially it addresses two questions. How do people who are isolated and divided ever manage to join together to make change? And then when they do, when people feel so powerless, how do they get some kind of power that allows them to affect these questions and many other questions: poverty, other forms of environmental degradation, political tyranny, and of course, as you know, the list goes on and on. So what we do know is that people do, in fact, historically and today, join together and make change, even though they have previously been isolated and felt entirely powerless. So the question is, how does that process occur? How does that happen? And the way I approach it is to think in terms of a transition or change, transformation from self-preservation to common preservation. It's an old cliche, but I think a pretty valid one, that self-preservation is the first instinct of humans. So how do we get from that to people engaging in some kind of collective action that's designed to meet their needs and address their problems? And the core idea of my book and my approach is that in today's world, common preservation in the face of things like climate change and nuclear war threats, common preservation is the prerequisite, it's the essential for self-preservation. And that to the extent people can incorporate that understanding, we have a basis for going forward and trying to build some kind of collective response that is driven by people's need for self-preservation, as well as for other more altruistic motivations as well. So we know that these things happen, but often they're thought of as sort of black swans, exceptions. When Occupy Wall Street broke out, it was like, well, this is completely doesn't fit in with any of our ideas about how society works. And that could go for many of the other movements that I've been involved with, participating in and studying. And in fact, I started making a little list from my book, Strike. Ben mentioned that this book was actually written more than 50 years ago, but I've had the opportunity to update it repeatedly since then. And I did one, there was just a year or two ago, 50th anniversary edition. And the latter part of it was an update with what I call the mini revolts of the 21st century. And I just want to mention the ones of the last half dozen years, so that we can see that this process of people who have been very divided and felt very powerless coming together is actually something we see going on and has been going on in our lifetimes. So I'll just mention, first of all, the strike movement of teachers, and it's really a teachers community coalition, but often spoken of as teachers' strikes, to defend and extend public education, which has been a huge, we think of the Chicago teachers, we think of Los Angeles, of huge movements, for example, in West Virginia that basically shut down the education system of the entire state. Another example, not so long ago, actually the day after Donald Trump's inauguration, was the Women's March, which as a matter of fact was the largest demonstration in American history up to that time. The March for Our Lives, which was the response to the Parkland shootings in Florida, were the largest youth protests since the Vietnam War. And these were things that seemingly came out of nowhere. It was organized by the students at Parkland who, after the shootings, decided, well, we have to do something. The Women's March was organized when somebody just put something on social media, and thousands of people started writing them and saying, we have to have a Women's March. I don't know how much you remember this, but you remember that there was a complete shutdown of the government for about 35 days. And finally, aircraft workers started holding sick-ins, call-ins where they would not come to work because they had what was sometimes called the blue flu. And that actually forced Trump to reopen the government because it looked like it was going to spread out of control. And then he said he was going to shut it down again. And the airline stewardesses organized other government employees and put out a call for general strike if the government was shut down again. And Trump just backed off, and the Congress passed legislation to change the conditions that were going to lead to that strike. I'm sure most of you remember the global youth strike for climate protection, which is an example of how these kinds of movements can go global. And finally, also illustrating that is the largest protest in American history, which was Black Lives Matter, and which involved tens of millions of people, very much across the most amazing lines, not only of Black and white, but also of geography, of many different kinds of differences in politics and society, social attitudes, but brought together millions and millions of people to say Black Lives Matter. So I could elaborate on all of those, but it shows that this idea of people who have been divided and who felt powerless coming together is something that really happens, and it happens in our time as it has in the past. So how does this happen? How do people move from self-preservation to common preservation that incorporates common self-preservation as a means, as an objective that you need in order to be able to survive? So my introduction to thinking about this question came from W.E.B. Du Bois's book, Black Reconstruction, which is a history of the uprising of African Americans who were enslaved in the South at the time of the Civil War. And Du Bois starts by saying, well, I don't believe that Blacks simply rose up instantly when the opportunity arose. When the Union armies began coming into the South, he said their attitude was to wait, listen, and watch. And they observed what was going on, and you're dealing with people who are, of course, powerless in an extreme measure as a result of their enslaved position, and also people who are isolated because most of them are on pretty remote plantations where they aren't have an easy way to group together, and they're forbidden to travel and visit. But what, according to Du Bois, was done as they began seeing that the Union Army was not returning slaves to their masters is that more and more and more, eventually hundreds of thousands ran away, so to speak. That is, they ran away from the plantation and went to the protection of the Union encampments. And this had two results. One was a withdrawal of labor power from the plantations and from the Southern economy, which had a devastating effect, major contribution to the defeat of the Confederacy. And it was what Du Bois called a general strike against slavery. And then, having withdrawn their labor, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, I believe a couple 100,000 went to work in support of the Union Army, and tens of thousands and growing numbers joined the Army and became soldiers. And this all played a crucial role in defeating the Confederacy. Du Bois said it decided the war. And this was basically a matter of self-organization. There was no one going out recruiting slaves to leave the plantations and come support the Union Army. It was their initiative, and it became more and more an organized initiative, and it became the basis for the Black role in Reconstruction, which is really the main part of Du Bois's book, which describes how the post-Civil War Southern governments were constructed on a biracial basis and developed a reform program, both of equal rights under law and of public education that was completely at all unheard of in the South, and potentially was creating a new society that was only destroyed by violence. Ku Klux Klan and the decision of the federal government to withdraw the troops that were protecting African Americans, former slaves, and the political alliances that they were involved with, withdrawing the troops and allowing the Ku Klux Klan and the other Southern forces of violence to reassert their authority. So this has always been for me a sort of touchstone for how even the most disempowered people are able to find ways to connect with each other and to assert some power in their situation. I'll just touch on a couple more briefly here. I had the good fortune to be very close to the origins of the women's liberation movement in the early 60s. I was an activist in SDS, and the early activities of the women's liberation movement really got started first in SNCC, and then the women who were connected both with SNCC and SDS began broadening out and having the meetings and raising issues about women's equality and about the way they were being treated in these supposedly progressive and left organizations. Now there's a backstory here, which is the overall problem of inequality and restricted roles for women. In this period, there was a very, very big push for women to get education. In fact, women often had a higher level of education on average than men in America up to this time. But nonetheless, they were restricted to roles that were essentially seen as just a homemaker. And this created tremendous contradictions between expectations and reality for women, which led people attempted to use individual strategies, education being a major one, and I don't know how to say it, being nice. Don't make people angry at you because you're an uppity woman, was a sort of get along by go along strategy. And they became less and less satisfactory. And when the first little bits of the women's liberation movement began developing, it basically spread like wildfire. And the vehicle was what was called a consciousness raising group, which was a group of women getting together and basically discussing what their experiences were in various spheres of life. And that rapidly developed into the women's liberation movement on a massive scale, and challenges to sexism in virtually every sphere of life, whether it was the home, the family, the workplace, rights of women to control their own bodies, equality in education and jobs, and just a proliferation of impacts. And I just want to take one from today, which we're seeing, which are at Amazon and Starbucks, the self-organization of workers. The organizations at Amazon is the Amazon Labor Union, and at Starbucks Workers United. These are not the result of established unions coming in and organizing people, recruiting members to their organizations. Both of these efforts have been the product of workers in those companies themselves, reaching out to other workers in those companies. There have been lots of attempts by other unions to organize, especially in Amazon, but these are the first ones that have actually succeeded to the extent that they have. So that's another example of people moving from isolation. And of course, Amazon and Starbucks had elaborate mechanisms, both for keeping workers down in various ways, for making them compete with each other, for creating incentive systems that would reward people for being good workers, but not rewarding them by giving them, protection against COVID or a decent amount of pay, but other things that they use for manipulative purposes. And the fact that people have gotten it together in some Amazon warehouses and other places. And in Starbucks, once the first election was won in Buffalo, there are now 200 Starbucks stores that are attempting to get union recognition and have elections. So that's the, you often feel, well, we're all divided, we're all opposed to each other, we can never get it together. That's what the people in all of these situations felt too. And what they found was that they were able to do things that originally they would never have been able to imagine. And usually the people, observers, analysts, social scientists, bosses, they also can't imagine these things. They say, oh, this is not something we either have to worry about or can hope for. So what's the dynamic? How does this happen? What is the process of moving to common preservation? I think the starting point, and a lot of the book is devoted to trying to make an analysis of that question. The starting point, I think, is usually the failure of individual solutions. And I think it's important to keep in mind that change, and in particular common preservation, often starts with failure. And as a result, it's very frustrating. When you're trying to get ahead. When you looked at the people who were involved with Occupy Wall Street, actually, it included a huge spectrum of people, but the core of it was people who had gone to college and maybe even started graduate school, and then their loans got higher and higher and higher. I'm sure some of you know what I'm talking about. My kids have this experience too. And then with the Great Recession, academic jobs closed up, and many, many of the other jobs that would have been available to this sector of people closed up. And that was a problem that they then discovered they were also sharing with a lot of other kinds of people who are not of the same generation or on the same track. Now, the failure of individual solutions can lead very reasonably to denial, to despair, or to submission. It does not automatically lead to common preservation, protest, or any other collective response. But what does lead to them is a recognition of the problems, and then the discovery that the problems are shared with other people. And this happens in many, many different ways. In the Occupy Wall Street context, there actually, somebody put up a Tumblr page that just had people say, it was like an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting where people get up and say, hi, I'm George, and I'm an alcoholic. And here's my story. And in a sentence, they say, I'm here because I was so drunk that I couldn't get up off the street yesterday, or whatever it is. So they said they went on Tumblr and took a photo of themselves with a poster with their name on it, and they said, I'm so and so on this little tiny mini video, and I tried to do everything right, and I went to college, and then my student loans became more than my annual income, and I couldn't go on, and now I'm doing whatever horrible job they were doing. And those went, and then other people would go look at those, and more became hundreds and hundreds. And that became a big part of what went into Occupy Wall Street. I could give similar kinds of processes for many, many other examples. You'll find a lot of them in Common Preservation. But once people begin to discover their problems are shared, the idea of taking action, some kind of collective action, at least becomes something that they can imagine. They can see that it's there potentially. Very often there are little episodes that begin to show that. I knew a woman who was she's about 15. She was an Italian immigrant in the early 30s, who eventually became the person that triggered the organization of 20,000 shirtwaist workers in the New York, New England region, garment workers. Many of the people that she worked with were Italian young women, 15, 16 years old. And she got mad one day because they changed the piece rate system. She said, you mean I'm going to have to produce 144 and you're going to pay me for 100? And so she organized a little tiny sit-down strike, and this is in the early 30s, just out of nowhere. And then over the course of a year or two, she got connected with the men who were picketing outside the factory, and eventually she and her girlfriends became the spearhead of what became a huge organizing campaign. So there are lots of ways in detail that can happen, but basically the idea, maybe we can get some power by doing something. Sometimes it's a quick action, sometimes it's something that people have been thinking about for a long, long time. But people see the possibility of getting something through collective action, and then they test it. And these would all be examples of people testing it and seeing what happens. And then usually the first thing you try doesn't necessarily work great. So you get a process of correcting and trying different things. And very often what happens is you'll have 5 or 6 little, for example, efforts to organize in Amazon or another work site, multiple site company. And then some group of people will come up with the formula, the set of tricks that are actually going to make it work. And that when that happens, then it turns out that many, many other people have been watching them. And so you get something like the Starbucks thing I was describing, where many people in Starbucks, I had some people visit me who were trying to organize Starbucks 5-6 years ago. They were Starbucks workers. They got to a certain point, and then but it didn't really catch. And then somebody does something, and if they find that something is going to work, then turns out, in this case, people in 200 other Starbucks almost instantly said, "Okay, we're going to do that too." So that's kind of the process. But that leads to the question of why people. So even if people get together, how can they have any power? How can they have? What does it mean? Isn't it meaningless? Can they really do anything? And so the other big theme of the book is about power and the nature of power. And the core idea that I would put out there is that power is basically rooted in dependence. So employers have power over workers because workers need jobs. They need a way to make a living, and they don't own the means of production, and so they have to go to work for those who do. They have to take a job. But there's also very often a counter dependence, and this is what isn't noticed so much, is that there is often a reciprocity of power. While workers are dependent on employers for their jobs, employers are dependent on their workers to be able to make money, because if the workers don't work, the machines don't roll, or the office doesn't go, and the making of money comes to a halt. So that mutual power and counterpower situation is, I believe, the norm in society. We have the idea that power is something that's exercised by central authorities, and they tell everyone else what to do. And if people don't do what they want them to do, they, one way or another, beat up on them, fire them, use violence against them. But power is actually based on the power of the powerful is based on the people who work for them, who serve in their armies. And that dependence is the hinge that allows people who are perceived as powerless, and usually perceive themselves as powerless, to develop some kind of counterpower. One favorite expression of this for me is a poem by Bertolt Brecht. I won't cite the whole thing, but he starts by saying, "General, your plane is a wonderful device. It can destroy a city. It can terrify a population, but it has one fault: it needs a pilot." And I've also was very much struck when I discovered that Gandhi, before he started his first civil disobedience campaign, observed the 1905 Russian Revolution and said, we can apply the Russian remedy. The 1905 revolution was basically a series of general strikes. And the conclusion that he came to is, even the most powerful cannot rule without the cooperation of the ruled. And this, of course, became the basis of the civil disobedience movement in India, and I believe is the basis of most social change movements, how they actually get their power. Takes the form of withdrawal of cooperation, as in a strike, withdrawal of consent in a political context, and the powerful depend on some active supporters and then the acquiescence of everyone else. So it depends on the people refusing to acquiesce in the exercise of power and domination over them, whether it's in the workforce or in a political system or gender relations or wide variety, colonial, imperial relations. That refusal to go on cooperating and acquiescing is central to making the power that allows people to make change. So let me just conclude here by looking at looking at the broad social problems that I started out with. And I'm not going to try to do any general analysis of either climate change or the renewed nuclear threat. Just throw out some things to think about. With climate insurgency, with the climate emergency, I've talked a lot about climate insurgency, what I characterize as a global, nonviolent, constitutional insurgency. So what's a nonviolent insurgency? When we think about insurgencies, it usually refers to arms resistance within a country, either to try to overthrow the existing government or for some group to withdraw and secede, or at least to establish a high level of autonomy for itself. And it usually is an armed struggle. A nonviolent insurgency similarly denies the legitimacy of the existing government, but instead of using violence, it uses the tactics of mass action. It uses general strikes. It uses, I don't know if you remember the Puerto Rican upheaval a couple of years back, where something like a third of the population of Puerto Rico went out on the streets, and they almost, in those numbers, hundreds and hundreds of thousands came to the capital, occupied the main highway of the country, held a general strike, and forced the governor, who had been caught in horrible, he was known as Ricky, and they were called Ricky Leaks, horrible series of statements derogatory to women, gay people, making fun of basically the people that he was supposed to be representing. And so a third of the population went to the Capitol and shut it down. Those kinds of tactics are what a nonviolent insurgency uses in place of the tactics of a violent insurgency. Global, because we're looking at, in the case of climate, or in the case of nuclear, the dynamics of nuclear holocaust, we're looking at global problems. They're not problems that the people of one country can solve themselves. So it needs to be transnational. And the movements, for example, the climate movement has, to a great extent, been at least globally hooked up. It has, it's pretty much organized on a national basis, but there's obviously large-scale cooperation internationally. But if we're going to have a global, a nonviolent constitutional insurgency, it's going to have to be on a much larger and much more globally integrated kind of scale. We saw something a lot like that with the global justice movement, or what I call globalization from below. And if you're interested in more on that, I did 2 books. One's called Globalization from Below, and one's called Global Village or Global Pillage, that are essentially about the global justice movement, the emergence of the global justice movement transnationally in the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century. So I think that the core point is so far we've had climate protests, climate movements. What I think has to happen, the problem is that the governments that we're trying to pressure and lobby are themselves at the core of the problem. And so I think what we have to do is have the movements, the climate movement, go to another stage where it says these governments are not legitimate because what they're doing is organizing and perpetuating the destruction of their own people and all the people of the world. And that would be a piece of what a move to common preservation in relation to climate would entail. If you want to know more, read the book and read my 3 other books on climate insurgency, which I'll be glad to tell you about. And let me just take one other example and talk about the problem of war and the issues that are being raised so devastatingly by the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the slaughter of Ukrainian people, and at the same time, the involvement of NATO and especially the United States in using that as a proxy war and trying to prolong it in order to weaken Russia and their willingness to say, as the saying goes, they're ready to fight Russia to the last Ukrainian. So in this situation, which is very reminiscent of the Cold War of the 50s and 40s, 50s, and 60s, where you have 2 sides that are both willing to engage in devastating destruction and perpetuate it, and where people like the Ukrainian people are essentially pawns of a geopolitical power game of the great powers. And I just had an interesting experience. I just happened to read somewhere about a group that's called Transnational Social Strike, and which I had never heard of. It's overwhelming. You're primarily European, doesn't have much presence here, but they have a series of forums that they've been holding with people from a couple dozen countries all around Europe, addressed to trying to, they say, we're not on the side of we're not on the side of the Russians, we're not on the side of NATO and the United States, we're on the side of people who are being hurt by this war. And we're working with women's groups, and their first activity, I think, was supporting the feminist resistance to the war in Russia. At the forums, they start out with someone from Ukraine and someone from Russia as the speakers, obviously people who are, generally speaking, they're part of the left, but they share this vision of trying to have some kind of transnational opposition to the whole process of the Ukraine war. They're going to do a transnational May Day strike against war. Probably won't get probably won't shut down Europe, but it's very interesting to watch it as the beginning of this process of people reaching out, looking around, seeing, oh, there's other people who sort of share this problem, even people who are supposed to be our enemies and are on the other side of very, very great divides. One thing that makes me think that a movement like this might become significant, even though it's definitely just a tiny touch of a beginning at this point, is that we had 15 million people worldwide in global demonstrations against the Iraq War. We weren't able to stop it, and that was a big failure. But I think the mobilization on that kind of scale is what it will take to have a significant impact, either on the Ukrainian war or on the loose talk about nukes that's going on in many, many quarters. So I think I will end it up right there and open it up for questions, which I'm very much looking forward to.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. Really appreciate you introducing us to some of the things that you wrote about in the book. And what I'll do is something I have not done and normally do not do, but I'm actually going to take the privilege of posing the first question to ask you a follow-up. Normally I go right to students. But I'll say that because we have a mix here, and we actually had I noticed Gus Smith was here for your talk. He maybe wasn't able to stick around for the discussion, but he joined us, and we actually started this class with two of Gus's books. But that reminded me of is that this is also not just sort of a guest talk for environment society, but also part of the Next System Speaker Series. I think that your book has a lot to offer those of us who are engaged in this project of Next System Studies. And I'm a social movement scholar, so I'm very interested in your book anyway. But most of the people I work with in the Next System arena are very focused on institutions and political economy, right? And I think that the way in which you develop the concept of equilibration, right? And what you call the heuristic of common preservation is very useful, both to those of us who are interested in the question of mobilization, and also those who are interested in the question of building alternative systems in the here and now, right? Building the next system below the surface of the existing one. And so I'll say, just because this is an academic setting, and maybe you normally don't like to bring in Piaget and so on, but you go into great depth in the text. If you could speak to equilibration and what that is and why it's so important to your theory, and then I'll hold my other question and reserve it until everybody else has had a chance to put it forward.
Great. Well, I love to talk about equilibration. I'm very happy to. I don't like to throw it to people who haven't had a chance to look at the book and learn some of the background from it, because it's a little hard to take in on the first shot. And so I apologize to those of you who are coming up against this for the first time. My thinking and the book are very much grounded in the work of Jean Piaget, who is often thought of as a child psychologist, but who is understood himself and is much better understood as somebody with a theory of development that reaches into many, many different fields. And by development, it means how do you, an organism, a system, a person, develop new ways that they didn't have before, that aren't just following through the patterns that they have, either internally, basically genetically born with, or externally imposed on them by something in the outside society. And he develops an elaborate theory of which the core concept is equilibration. And to try to do an accessible presentation of what that means. The core idea is that this whole process is, well, let me go back. In many social sciences, we have the idea of an equilibrium, and you understand a society or a system as an equilibrium, and the different parts balance each other, and sometimes something goes out of its norms or its average or its regular condition, and then it goes back, and that's out of equilibrium, but then the system brings it back into equilibrium. And the equilibrium point or set point, and the various names that are used for what are basically the same ideas. And this leads you not to really, this doesn't give you any way to understand actual change. And usually it's used to deny the reality of actual change and to say, well, there's some deviations that happen, but they are really just deviations within the system, and the system then more or less automatically restores itself. Piaget starts at a very different point. Instead of equilibrium, he starts from the idea of disequilibrium, and that at least human systems, but he's also very deeply involved with biology, and biology, so it includes biological systems, are usually not in equilibrium, but in disequilibrium. There are gaps between the things that would, or imbalances, however you want to talk about it, that make it be unstable, not constantly reproducing its own values, norms. Again, there's a variety of languages in which this is talked about. But the person or organism or system is constantly being put out of balance and is faced with the challenge of how to restore balance. And the existing, if it was able to use its existing patterns to restore the balance, there wouldn't be any problem. This wouldn't be a theory of disequilibrium. It would be equilibrium that you were moving toward. But in the framework of disequilibrium, the system or person or whatever has to create something new in order to be able to not be harmed or destroyed by the disequilibrium. And so what happens is that the gap, the disequilibrium, kicks off a search for some kind of new solution to the problem. And that is, and so that's, and you can see this very abstract model. If you think about the examples I gave and how I analyzed them, you can see that the particular emergence of problems, people having established patterns, and then problems emerging with those patterns, and that kicking off a search for some kind of new solution. And then specifically in the formation of social movements case, that new solution turns out to be finding other people who are facing the same problem and then getting together with them and opening up a new set of possibilities for action and for power. But you can see how this is rooted in the Piagetian equilibration theory that I was just attempting to explain. I started out with concrete instances, especially with labor and working class class formation processes. And then when I discovered Piaget, I began to see, well, or at least ask, could we use some of this equilibration model or theory for it? And this is a big part of what I attempt to do in the book, is to actually do that. So that's an underlying theoretical frame that the more concrete development of social movements and development of their power comes out of. And there are a lot of links between the different layers that can be made, but I'd welcome follow-up on this, but why don't I stop there as far as the presentation.
Right. That's great. Thanks so much for doing that. I think that's really a very useful contribution that you made with the book, among many others. Let's open it up. And there are a couple of ways we can do this. You can get on the stack by putting your name in the chat. You can do it by using the reaction tool, the raised hand. And I'll just sort of act as the conductor to help us move through here. Where's the head exploding emoji? Ronnie Galvin. that was exactly what happened when I read that. My head exploded, and I emailed a bunch of people, which is why I think probably Gus was here earlier. So I'm going to follow up with him and send him that little passage because I think it really is quite useful, Jeremy. I really do. It's really a great contribution. Who has a follow-up question or another thing to offer here? Don't be bashful. Otherwise, I may go to Karthik. Oh, there he is. Your questions were at the top of the ones that I sent, but there were some great questions from Sarah and from Sujita and others from the class. So
and I'm enjoying guessing which questions came from which students.
Yes, you got it.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I had another question that I didn't put on the list, but it's related to sort of energy, movement energy. What do you think about the role of energy in terms of sustaining the movement? Because we see that there is this big, we need to throughout your book, you discuss how we have to overcome this inherent desire to focus on self-preservation. And in order to overcome that and focus on common preservation, it requires a certain level of energy which we draw from our social movement or in some form. So how do we? In all the examples that you gave, I can see that the energy is produced and it's maintained, but to look at systemic change, to think about systemic change or structural change, it to me it feels like the energy needs to be humongous. How do we produce that and sustain it?
Yeah, great question, and I don't have a cut and dried answer to it. But there certainly are movements that have been able to sustain effectively over long periods of time, decades, and in some cases even a century. They probably are the exception. And I think there's various levels, and a lot of it is, let's say it's an area where a lot of experimentation is called for. One aspect is creating a social environment that provides for a lot of other needs besides some other needs besides the formal political or social objective of the movement. So many of the socialist movements in the late 19th, early 20th century, very much religious movements, Christian movements, Muslim movements, draw heavily on providing welfare, healthcare, education, other things that meet people's needs and that allow them to have ongoing incentives for participation that are not just the achievements of the movement in reshaping society in some way. So I think that's one element of the answer. I think it's some movements are good at constantly creating new short-term objectives that are steps towards a longer-term objective. And if you don't do that, there are a lot of problems that result. If you have a short-term objective that you can never win, and it doesn't seem to lead anywhere, it's very demoralizing. If you have, I mean, it's also very easy to have a short-term objective and realize it and then go home and have a drink. And there's nothing wrong with that if you come back the next day, but there's victories also can have a demobilizing effect. So something that, and it's a great question. I want to think about it more myself, as well as hoping you and others will. But there need to be ways to break down the bigger objectives into concrete, smaller objectives that allow you to have struggles that are meaningful and mobilizing as you go along, without having to give up your, you can keep your eyes on the prize, but you can have your hands on the plow too. So that's it. But it's something we can all learn more about, I think, through experimentation. And actually it'd be a great subject for someone to research as in terms of examples. There are definitely ones that have been very effective with this. The MST in Brazil is a case of a movement that's been able to maintain very, very large, high level of energy and mass participation for decades. And there was a recent article by Mark Engler that's floating around on the web. That's an analysis and interviews with MST folks largely about how they do that. So wanted to stop there, but there would definitely be more to be said, and not all of it by me.
Thank you.
Great. Who's next? I see a question from John Peck in the chat, and I'm wondering, John, are you able to vocalize that verbally?
Yeah, I can certainly do that. I've known Ben for quite a while, and we've been involved in these struggles forever, and I've read a lot of Jeremy's books, but I'm just curious, Jeremy, your take on the whole violence versus nonviolence strategy towards social change, because this has been a big debate, especially with Ukraine. I definitely saw this in Oaxaca when I was there. Like, do we, I mean, we were there with activists who actually did kidnap police in exchange for political prisoners during the protest. That was part of what they were doing, to free their comrades from being tortured in prison. And I know the ANC did this. I mean, this has happened all around the world, and it's sort of an outside strategy. So I'm curious what your thoughts are about how we negotiate that in our current political climate. Because I know in the US that will result with lots of oppression, but maybe in other places this is more an acceptable strategy.
So let's start with the ethical side of the question, which is, I don't personally take an absolute pacifist position. I think if somebody can get their comrades out of prison by kidnapping an authority, I don't have any moral objection to that per se. Whether it is, I would say the conditions under which it can be effective are very, very unusual. And it's largely a question of scale. It's not you could do something like that at a very local level. You could possibly do it in Oaxaca because basically the writ of the national government didn't run there, and you could, it would not be, for them to send the army in would have taken a lot, would have had a lot of costs for the national ruling elite. So you could get away with something like that. On the other hand, if usually that kind of violence leads to counter mobilization on a much larger scale, either by the authorities or by vigilantes. And so it has to be evaluated not just on a one-off, hey, we managed to use violence to chase away some goons or something like that, but in the broader context, is it actually effective? I think you would find that the cases where it is are quite unusual. And so you can have a situation where, nothing fails like success. And you can have a situation where you have a short-term success with violence and a long-term horrible repression and defeat that results from it. That's a very common story, and that's why governments and police forces and other agents of oppression like to have agents provocateurs who use violence on a false flag basis in order to let the violence be pinned on movements or protesters. So there's another piece of this also that I think is, to me, the most important, which is what I view demonstrations and social action of various kinds as, in large parts, attempts to reach out to, educate, and recruit wider and wider parts of the population. That it's really propaganda as a deed, and that it is, and not in the classic violent sense, but in the sense of making a position, educating people to seeing that, oh, these people are trying to stop a pipeline, fossil fuel pipeline. Why? First of all, oh, I wonder if they have a reason for doing that. And second of all, gee, I wonder if something like that could be effective. And basically what you're trying to do is persuade millions of people that, yeah, there's a really good reason for doing that. This business plan of the company that's doing this is to destroy us. And yeah, they can have some effect on this. And if more people join them, they could have even more effect. That's what you're trying to do. And so usually violence by movements and protesters has a negative impact on that process, because what you're really trying to do is persuade them that you, the movement, are the pro-social force, that you are the people who are trying to help and protect and defend ordinary folks against a rogue regime that is destroying the world in the interest of the fossil fuel companies that control it. And obviously you could apply the same logic to a lot of other situations. So that is usually undermined, either distracted or actually denied by, in any case, undermined by movement violence. And it provides a perfect opportunity for the opponents of the movement to paint the movement as either self-seeking or irresponsible or a threat to the very people you're trying to recruit. It gives them a golden weapon.
And I should say about John that not only have we known each other for, I don't know, 28 years probably, but he's also one of my favorite economists and executive director of Family Farm Defenders. So somebody who you should read his stuff, and for everybody here has a lot to offer. So thanks for joining us tonight, John. And I don't know if you had a follow up on that, or if that was good for the moment. All right, let's go around. What other questions do we have other interventions that people want to make. All right, I see Ronnie here. Ronnie Galvin, Greater Washington Community Foundation, and a pleasure to see you again. We're seeing a lot of each other.
I know,
So glad
man.
you made it.
We're
Yeah,
gonna keep seeing more.
excellent.
And I caught wind of this on social media, and I was like, man, that just the title of your book, Jeremy, it caught my attention. I haven't read it yet, but I've already secured a copy. I've also secured a copy. They're very limited, of course, of what was it? Global Village or Global Pillage. Just got that. I didn't know that book existed. So I'm looking forward to catching up with you and being in dialogue with Ben and you and other folks in the work. So you mentioned early in your talk, and then later when you were talking about Piaget, that movements often are sparked when people experience, I'm paraphrasing, so correct this if I'm wrong. People notice, experience patterns of failure, and then they are ready to react. And at our foundation, we have a new strategy, 10-year strategy to close the racial wealth gap. And as we are talking about the systems that produce the gap and trying to point folks to the possibility for designing a system that can produce the outcomes we want, I often find myself, and I'm also theologically trained, in the tradition of the prophets, and I don't think they all have to be religious, standing up saying, the system, trying to convince people that the system is failing, right? And, there's a quote that is often attested to Harriet Tubman. I guess we don't know for sure if she said it, but it's attributed to her. And it says, I could have actually freed more people from enslavement if I could have convinced them that they were actually enslaved. Sounds like the Matrix almost, right? And so it's kind of editorial comment, but also the question is in the grand scheme of things, the balance between like failure as a motivating factor, or vision as a motivating factor, which one of those do you think is most compelling spark for movement? And you got to have both, but when folks are recognizing and experiencing the patterns of failure, does the vision already have to be there, or is the failure enough to noticing failure enough to motivate them? That's one question. And then the second question is, Professor Mansky, you and other folks can weigh in on this. How much more damn failure do we need to have in order for all of us to get in the boat together and figure out we're all we got, this is the only rock we got, this is our only shot, right? How much more failure do we need? And so I'm wondering if failure really is it, because the whole planet is literally failing in our face. And we can't seem to convince enough folks or enough people in the right places, if we're working catalytically, to actually create the shift with the level of urgency that I think we need to have. So anyway, so I'm just curious about this balance between compelling failure or compelling vision, and how much more damn failure do you think we need in order to get this thing going?
Well, I'll do my best to respond, but don't expect an adequate answer. I want to start with the first part of what you said about I could get more people to leave slavery if they understood they were slaves. And this is definitely, in various manifestations, part of what people leads people to not change into an active, challenging mode, is that our oppression is so normalized that we don't. It's only when something special comes along that falls outside of what we already accept as just the way things are, that let's say that often triggers a response of, well, we got to do something about this. The Amazon strike on Long Island is an interesting example of that, because there, people have been trying to organize Amazon for decades, and there have been some fairly substantial efforts, but none of them took off. As with many of the more recent labor developments, the emergence of the COVID pandemic created a situation where all of a sudden the problems, just feeling you're being kicked around and you feel lousy, you can't go to the bathroom, et cetera, all of a sudden the powerlessness became life-threatening. And if you couldn't get protective equipment, it was literally a life-threatening situation. And that is one of the things that kicked the Amazon strike, for example, of the Amazon organizing campaign over the top and moved them to be able to recruit a majority of workers. By the time they were doing that, it wasn't COVID, but the conditions were set by Amazon's response to COVID. So I think that's one part of the story, is that something, it's not great when something bad happens, but it does kick people in the ass and leads them to say, wait, maybe we have to do something different. And I just want to give one more example of this, of the change that you're talking about, the Harriet Tubman change. I was actually watching a rally at Yale University of white collar workers, overwhelmingly women, who were trying to organize, and whose big thing was the wage gap and how many cents on the dollar a woman made relative to an equivalent male worker. And there was somebody, they had a rank and file worker speaking on the platform, and she was describing conditions where she, in her shop, her office, and all of a sudden she looked up, and it was as if she was having an epiphany at that moment, and she said, and I do believe I'm being discriminated against. And in spite of her own direct experience and what she had heard from the union and the statistics and education that had been presented about the wage gap, it was an epiphany for her to actually put it all together and say, well, this is me, and this is actually, this is real, this is really happening. And I think for all of us, in many aspects of our lives, we have to go through a process to get to the point where we recognize that. So I just wanted to underline what you were saying and say, I think that's a critical piece of this whole process. And I could talk about how you would analyze that at Piaget in terms and so on, but we don't need to do that now, because I want to get onto the failure versus vision core of your comments. I think there, the way I would approach this is that we mostly operate through patterns. They're patterns that can change, or we couldn't bother having this discussion. We should just go home and have a drink. But they are basically through patterns. And the point of the failure is not that failure is, beneficial in some way, but the failure shows the inability of the pattern to meet our needs, the pattern that we're following. And so it creates a situation where people want something else. The role of vision is very, very important in many ways. But people don't care about an alternative. Generally speaking, people don't care about an alternative vision unless they have something that makes them say, well, what's here, what I'm doing now, or what I'm experiencing now sucks, and I can't stand it, and I'm either gonna become a junkie, or I'm gonna try to do something about it. And then when they say, yeah, but what can you do about it? That's the point at which they're, oh, well, you know what? There's somebody over there who's having the same problem. There's someone over there who's having the same problem. What would happen if at least we just got together and talked about it and discuss whether there's anything we can do about it together? So the point about failure is, first of all, it's about the failure of existing patterns. It's not my failure as a human being in life, because it's easy to interpret it that way, and that is debilitating. That is demobilizing. It's when you see it's a particular pattern of attempting to, a particular strategy is a term I sometimes use for meeting your needs and solving your problems, and that's what's not working, and that's what needs to be changed. That's when failure becomes something that puts people in a position to start trying to look for something new. So why don't I stop right there? Obviously, and I'm sure you have things to contribute on this too, but that's how I would start looking at it.
That was really a wonderful set of questions there, Ronnie. Really, really appreciated it. And I want to see if there's other questions that come forward. And as you're formulating your question, if you haven't already been doing that, I just want to say that as somebody who's very much engaged with the formal social movement studies literature, right? Your approach, Jeremy, resonates a lot with a tradition that some of us call the praxis tradition in social movement theory. Sort of these three sort of living traditions in social movement theory around sort of paying attention to the praxis of activists and movements, understanding movements as forms of contentious politics, or understanding movements as primarily meaning makers, right? Engaged in the process of interpreting and contesting interpretation, constructing identity, et cetera. And all three have a lot to contribute. And so for me, the failure that really sort of jumped out for me was the failure of movements and the learning process of activists and movements when they find that the patterns of practices that they have been engaging in aren't working anymore. And so that it's not so much that there's a generalized recognition of failure, but it's actually a recognition on the part of those who are already trying to change things. When they recognize that the things that they're doing, the sort of combination of tactics that they pull from their grab bag that we call the tactical repertoire, that's not working anymore. And that it causes them to have to, as Richard Grossman used to put it, rethink, right? To engage in a process of rethinking and start anew and start afresh. And that's the inventive, that's that incredibly sort of creative moment, right? So I came away, I just want to say, I came away feeling a bit better about the climate crisis after that, because I think that's sort of part of the message about the climate movement that you're getting out there, that by facing our failures head on, we can do the same thing that's been done before, right? Is to find our way out of it. So I just that's my follow-up on Ronnie's intervention and on your book. But I want to ask, Sarah, you had some great questions that you posed. I want to go to you and sort of put you on the spot if you're willing to vocalize.
Oh, of course, always. That's what I do. But yeah, so my research is in global fisheries management, and it's actually started tailoring itself towards fishermen's, fishers, social movements and stuff like that. Because as I was a biology major in my undergrad, focusing in marine sciences, there was always this narrative of fishers are the enemy, people who catch fish are they're the ones degrading and destroying our environments and stuff. And of course, as I've gone into global affairs and leaned more into the social sciences, I have learned that's not really the case I've seen. So I've just leaned in my own research, looking at fisheries movements globally, but also starting to look at them locally, especially within the Chesapeake Bay, and the impact, because like fishers and fishing communities are the ones really that are seeing the impacts of climate change intensely in their communities, with the lack of their lack of catch, and also the changing shoreline and the changing ecosystems that they depend on. So one of the things I've come to challenge in my own research is the concept or the narrative of tragedy of the commons, and I just continue to see it used by marine scientists and not climate scientists, but just ecological scientists. And I've argued against tragedy of the commons, but yeah, I've just wanted to pose that question to you because it's something that came up as I was reading your book.
Great. So
Oh, you just muted yourself.
okay.
Actually, I did that. I did that to Jeremy. I was trying to fix the sound problem. I apologize, Jeremy.
Are we okay?
We're good now. Yes.
Okay, good. So yeah, tragedy of the commons. I actually wrote a review of a book that if you don't know it, you might want to know it. It's called Green Governance, Ecological Survival, Human Rights, and the Law of the Commons by Burns Weston and David Bollier, which is a deep dive into the questions of commons and the commons law. I did a review of it. So that's the one case where I've really written about commons. I also live in a commons, so I have a little experience personally with this. And one of the things that the Green Governance book says is, well, tragedy of the commons, let's talk about the tragedy of the market. And when you look at the actual functioning of markets, you see that the problems that they present, both in practice and you can also analyze them in theory, are huge compared to the problems of commons. But maybe we should say, do you want to explain briefly what the tragedy of the commons is? Or do you want me to take a shot at it?
If you want to explain, I can quickly just tragedy of the commons is the Malthusian thought of that in human nature, we're all trying to exploit nature as far as we can and to gain as much resources as we can. And so the tragedy of the commons is there's too many people going after too little resources. So that's just quick.
And so you get overgrazing, you get deforestation, you get a devastation of the resources, and that's the conclusion that the economists draw. And therefore, the only way to avoid that is to have a market, so people have to pay someone else for whatever use they're making of those resources. So, I want to say a couple of things about it, and they may be arguments that are useful for you in arguing against it. The first thing is, and I should say that the tragedy of the commons was an essay, I believe, in Science magazine that was written by Garrett Hardin, and this whole line of argument stems from that. First of all, it's a historical travesty. The reality is that the commons were not destroyed by overgrazing or overuse by the peasants. They were destroyed by the enclosure of the commons by elite landowners who wanted to grab the land that had traditionally been used by the community. And there's a famous poem about this that goes, the law condemns the man or woman who steals the goose from off the common, but lets the greater felon loose who steals the commons from the goose, about the enclosure movement. There is an economist named Eleanor Ostrom. Are you familiar with her work? Oh, okay. This is who spent decades studying actual commons, and then she had a center and students who were working with her, and they did actual in-depth research on hundreds of commons around the world. And eventually she got a Nobel Prize in economics for this work, first woman ever to get a Nobel Prize in economics. And what she discovered in her research was that that real life commons actually have their own governance structure. It may be informal, but they have their own, usually make quotas for the amount of resources that people can utilize. There's a wonderful book about the commons and the Lake District in England, which has, in the higher mountainous areas, has commons of sheep farmers, and they have they have rules about how much land each farmer can use, how many sheep they can run, et cetera, et cetera. And in part, this is because normally a commons is something that lasts generations, and people want to be able to go on using the resource, and they want their children and their grandchildren to be able to use the resource. And so they make rules that are designed to protect the resource. Now, there's always lots of bickering about how do you enforce the rules, and what's the real, in my little commons, there's kind of lots of controversy about who can build where, and can you put an addition on your house. And there's a governing structure that's basically a direct democracy, and people hash it out and eventually come up with something that everyone can live with. So, but it is not a free-for-all in which everybody runs as many sheep on the mountainside as they want. It's a rule-governed and usually democratically, at least in most respects, managed system. And it is a third alternative. That what the economists normally say is there are only two ways you can organize the coordination of economic activity. One is a market, and the other is command, as they say, authority, like in a corporation or an army. And the commons is unquestionably a third possible way of organizing economic activity and coordination. So take that for what it's worth and throw it in their face.
That's really helpful, especially because a lot of the solutions to like the overfishing problem is the privatization of the ocean, which doesn't work. This like splitting up the ocean and putting borders on the ocean doesn't work the same as on land, because the resources move differently in the ocean. But biologists are seeing a very interesting thing happening in the Atlantic with the ocean warming. The fisheries are moving north. So when we think of the lobster fishery in Maine, now it's moving into Canada, to where there's where that's going to change a whole fishery dynamic. But we're also seeing a fishery coming into the Chesapeake Bay of shrimp that's here all year round that doesn't actually have a fishery built around it, because it only used to be in the bay for like 4 months out of the year, to where there's I feel like there's potential for cooperation with building new fisheries and such. But yeah, I'll definitely be doing more research, but I appreciate your take on it.
Yeah, the Ostrom will be very, very helpful and interesting to you. I have a very dear friend, Brent Smith, who has something called Green Wave, which he was a commercial fisherman and then became an oyster fisherman, and now is developing co-ops for ecological combination of oystering, kelp growing, salt harvesting, and other economic and other activities, and has many former fisher people who are taking on his proposals, as well as indigenous groups and many, many others. I think you would find it fascinating, and it may be in some ways germane to what you're looking at.
Wonderful. That was great. I saw that Ben, my doppelganger here, I guess that's not quite correct, but you had a question, and I'm wondering, are you able to verbalize with your connection today?
Yes, please.
Excellent.
So I know there has been a lot of movements in Africa even before the Arab Spring, those that we experienced in South Africa with apartheid and all this. But currently, we look at series of series of movements being thwarted by the successive governments in Africa. I mean, whatever the situation is, for them to come together to protest and do all that. But in what ways can they, including me as an African, go about it for it to become much more successful on the continent?
First of all, I should say I have very inadequate knowledge of anything connected with this. I see someone in the chat has put in some responses to this.
Yeah.
In terms of the historical movement in South Africa, which I do know a little bit about, but no point in repeating it here. The things that I'm most familiar with are the women's reforestation movements that were challenged the economic development strategies that some of the governments were using, and which were leading to massive deforestation, and that they were able to have restore millions of trees and important forest areas. So it's certainly something that there certainly are ways that these things can be done, even when you're dealing with unsympathetic or hostile government authorities. I think the places where there have been effective labor movements would be another case of it. And I know that they're very weak now, but Africa has had very effective labor movements in a number of countries in past times, and they often played a leading role in bringing together other social forces around more progressive forms of economic development. The fragmentation along ethnic lines is a very serious problem. But the interesting thing in both of those examples, both the trade union example and the women's movements, is that they've very often been able to transcend ethnic divisions and bring people with different backgrounds together in their in their activities. And I probably should stop right there because I'm the one that needs to be educated here.
Well, and let me just throw it open since I put it in the notes, and we all have different regions of the world that we know best, right? And I've, as I said to you, Ben, I've only been just the edges of Africa, but we have somebody here who actually did their doctoral work in Zimbabwe. So John Peck is here, and I just, and just to say, I know your interest is primarily in West Africa, West Sub-Saharan Africa, and sort of Ghana, Nigeria, Gambia, et cetera, right? John, just to put you on the spot, since you're such a wealth, is there any chance you might have some recommendations for Ben in this regard? Wangari Maathai comments there, but yeah. Excellent. Well, I'll work to help make some of those connections. I
did just post something in the chat. I mean, just to share that I actually was able to, when Wangari Maathai came to the US for the first time, I was at Columbia University. I took her to speak. She had never been to the US before, but she had almost been killed by in Kenya for her work with the Greenbelt movement. So, I mean, people like that are pretty amazing. I mean, I can think of lots of other people, Ken Saro-Wiwa in Nigeria. I can think of, so many other activists in Africa and other parts of the world, Chico Mendes, who have been, Berta Cáceres, and who have been, basically murdered, assassinated for their work on these issues. So it's something to realize that this is heavy work. This is hard to do. And we're in the United States right now. And, I'm always amazed at people who work on this stuff in other countries, like the struggles they're in. And, our solidarity with them is really important. That's why, Jeremy is writing on, that's, his work is so inspirational. That's why I'm hoping people read his stuff, because it shows that social change makes a difference. A lot of people right now are really cynical and depressed. We're coming out of a pandemic. We're in the midst of a global crisis, and people need inspiration. And, this is one of my challenges as both as a professor, as an activist, is like, how do I give young people, other people, hope? And that's what I find so exciting about reading Jeremy. His strike book is fantastic. It shows the power of labor organizing and what can be actually done. And I really hope that, people take that to heart and that inspires them in their work, because, I don't want to just be an academic. I want to make the world a better place. And that's what Jeremy helps us do. Like, bring this knowledge into the real world. The praxis Ben was talking about earlier. That's what's so important about this. So I can stop there. So thanks. Yeah.
Excellent. Yes, and I'll make the connections that we're talking about in the chat as well. And John, would you be up for connecting with Ben as well, just in terms of his doctoral work?
Oh, sure. I'm happy to do that. So yeah. Okay,
great. And I will make the connection with Ronnie as well. I'm really happy to see that. Yeah. Great. Jackie and Abby, and you had some great questions as well. And then I also know that James and Lupe were here from the Next System Fellows, who are undergrads who are studying systemic movements, system design, and system change. Wondering if any of you have anything you'd like to put forward. Looks like maybe that's happening.
Sorry, technical difficulties.
No worries.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting that we're talking about, commons management and all of that stuff. I think that that is a important part of frontiers in political economy, is how to essentially bring back, the commons as like a mode of producing things for communities. And, that's kind of what, community rights, which is one of the concepts that I was researching in the Democratizing Nova internship, like is about, having the right to the land that you are on, in terms of like being able to, utilize that, have a garden or something like that, and not having your landlord be like, no, you can't do that actually. Stuff like that is, quite critical. And I think that, that's part of like worker self-management and, liberation in general. Yeah.
Amen. Thank you.
And I'm just to pick up from that, commons are not, they're often thought of as historical and things that are either of the past or are dying out. But in fact, there's a lot of commons movements and activities that are very recent and very vibrant. The community gardens movement in probably every major city would be an example of that. In New York, there are hundreds and hundreds of community gardens, and they have an organization that ties them together. Another thing that you might not think of, but that is surely meets the definition of a commons, would be Wikipedia, which is very much a rule-governed, self-governing economic resource in which there's no market, and there's really no command. There are some rules, there are struggles over who gets to make the rules to some extent, but it's neither a market nor a command institution. It is a commons.
Excellent. Other questions or thoughts before we go? I think we're coming up on our reasonable limit for what we can put a guest through, but the discussion has been wonderful. Other thoughts or questions? I should say, I know that a number of our undergrads, in fact, both who are here are applying to graduate programs. So John, you got to get James out to Wisconsin, and Lupe, we're hoping to keep here, although we'd keep you too, James, for sure. Yeah, excellent. Going once, twice. Okay, so Jeremy, I really want to thank you again for making the time on a very quick invitation that I made to you I think just a month ago to put this on your schedule to join us for the seminar, to make it available to others. Thank you for sharing your work. I think you can see that there's a lot of light bulbs that you've turned on for a lot of people here. Please join me in sharing your appreciation, however you'd like to do that. You can cheer. And hope everybody has a wonderful holiday weekend.